helping me be my second brain as we are looking at this disease and its possible effect to the state of North Carolina. So the reason that we are having this call is because we have had the first confirmed detection of New World screwworm in the United States, in the state of Texas, in Zavala County, at the end of last week. And subsequently, we've had a few other positive cases that have come through as well. Now, I just want to let people know that there's an element when you have few positive cases that occur after the initial positive. That is a normal situation based upon sampling, and people are looking for the disease now. So the fact that we've had a few other positives in the state of Texas is not a bad sign. It means that people are looking more in depth and stuff. And so to some extent, that could be interpreted as a good sign. Now, looking at a positive detection in the state of Texas, that is disappointing, but not unsurprising, especially given the few weeks that preceded that and the number of cases that were occurring south of the border in relatively close proximity to the United States. And also considering that all models had looked like we would have New World screwworm in the United States last summer. And because of creativity with the few sterile fly populations that we had, a lot of the collaborative efforts between USDA and Mexico were able to keep it out of the United States last year, giving us a little bit of time. And Dr. Thompson will go into that a little bit more in depth as well. In general, as far as our state preparedness, we've been working very closely with South Carolina. Dr. Mike Nault, who used to be the livestock director here in North Carolina, is the state vet in South Carolina. He has been serving on the national working group for New World screwworm. And so as such, and as we do in a lot of things, the Carolinas have worked closely together on looking at development of plans and treatment modalities and things along those lines. And we continue to work towards that as we look at Texas and monitor the status of the disease there. We are also working collaboratively with the state veterinarian of Pennsylvania, who has drafted some language for importation of animals from Texas and infested areas that mirror a lot of what Texas is professing to do on the ground right now. And the goal there is to basically give us at the state level, as a receiving state, some ability to kind of have more oversight if animals are being brought into the state illegally or inappropriately at this time. So we are working both with North Carolina, South Carolina collaboration, and then also reaching out to Pennsylvania and working through language that might clarify what importation of these animals would look like as they come into the United States and where they would come in from. In general, we are looking very, very closely at all certificates of veterinary inspections coming from the state of Texas, and especially very closely on certificates of veterinary inspection coming from the regions where we have positive cases. And we will be working through those and assessing those individually to try to make sure that we are trying to keep the state of North Carolina as safe as possible while maintaining continuity of business at the same time. So that's kind of the broad umbrella overview. At this point in time, I will go ahead and turn this over to Dr. Jessie Thompson, and she will go through more of the details. And then at the end, we'll take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Martin. I think everybody can see the dashboard. I'm going to try to share my slides. All right. Can you see my slides on top of the dashboard now? Okay.
Yes.
Awesome. All right. Like Dr. Martin said, I'm a regional veterinary medical officer with our livestock section at Vet Division. So normally, I'm a field veterinarian, so I'm kind of covering the eastern part of North Carolina field activities, and I've kind of been keeping my eye on the flies as they've been progressing over the last year or so. I'm going to start out with some kind of fly basics. I'll talk a little bit about the Texas detections and the Texas movement restrictions, kind of expounding a little bit on what Dr. Martin talked about. And then I'm going to hit the highlights. We'll talk a little bit about the outbreak as it's progressed up through Central America and Mexico, just so you kind of get a overview of that and how it has moved. And then talk through signs, symptoms, kind of hit the key points of things I think you need to know about and look for, and what makes this different from regular blowflies and regular maggots. So that's what screwworm is. If you're interested in hearing some other overview webinars about screwworm, there's some really good ones out there. This won't be a total comprehensive everything you need to know. This is going to be kind of the high points, but I'll point you to some good overview webinars if you're interested in more about the actual fly and fly behavior later. But for now, it's a blowfly, and we have flies like that here. So we have flies that lay eggs that hatch into maggots right here in North Carolina kind of normally. So it's not unheard of for us to have wounds infested with maggots in a normal summer. What makes these maggots worse is that they feed on living tissue. So the normal flies and the normal maggots that we're dealing with in North Carolina feed on dead and dying tissue. These maggots feed on living tissue. So the name of the fly also, unfortunately, means man-eater, translates to man-eater. That is a really unfortunate naming convention that we're stuck with. So you might see news articles saying things like, the man-eating fly. That's where that comes from. But this is mostly affecting animals. That adult female fly is going to lay her eggs near a wound, and that can be a really tiny wound. So these flies are a little bit more aggressive than our normal flies. So these maggots will infest wounds that wouldn't normally maybe have an infestation, like a tick bite or a tagging site. She'll find a wound, and if she can't find a wound, she'll take a mucosal surface. So eyes, nose, ears, that kind of thing. And then we talked about how they differ from our native flies in that they feed on living tissue, not dead tissue. This is also a warm-blooded animal pest. So it's talked a lot about in livestock industry, and by far and away, the most commonly affected animals and outbreaks tend to be livestock. But this is also a disease of wildlife. Just because the most commonly reported is livestock doesn't necessarily mean that's the most commonly affected. It can definitely affect wildlife. It can definitely affect dogs, cats. Rarely affects birds, and rarely affects humans. Just because all of the same things that prevent regular flies and maggots from infesting wounds will also prevent these. So if you're normal kind of able-bodied person who's able to keep flies off of their open wounds or keep their open wounds covered, you're not going to have to deal with infestations. So seems like birds do a little bit better job at maybe preening, cleaning themselves than livestock can with getting eggs off of their wounds. So this picture, I really like this picture. I'm not going to show you guys too many gross pictures. I thought this was a good picture example for today because we see maggots in a wound that maybe normally wouldn't be infested with maggots. It's not uncommon to see this is an ear tag in a cow ear. It's not uncommon to see an ear tag site become infected. It's pretty rare to see that ear tagging site have maggots in it. So this is a good example of maggots in a wound where you normally wouldn't find maggots. And it's a good example of a really bloody discharge. Normally, wounds with maggots in them don't have a bloody discharge. They'll have a discharge, but it's not usually this much blood. And so those are kind of two hallmarks. Maggots in wounds where you wouldn't normally see maggots, and a really bloody discharge out of a wound that make us think, I wonder if this is screwworm. So that they are different from our normal maggots. I'm not going to bore you guys to death with the life cycle. I did want to point out that it can be kind of fast. So the eggs will hatch usually in less than a day, and then those larvae, those maggots, will mature to pupal stage in less than a week. So we don't have a lot of time necessarily that maggot is visible on the animal. Most people aren't really appreciating visible maggots until about day 3. So if you're not seeing the maggot until it's 3 days old, it might not stick around but another 2 days before it's mature enough to exit the wound and then pupate into a fly. So identifying wounds, identifying larvae, and then not allowing the animal to move while it has an infective stage larva on it are going to be key to keeping it from spreading. And like you can see in this picture, actually, I don't think I pointed it out. You can actually see eggs. So you can see eggs. It's not like the eggs are microscopic. They're just not easy to see. So it's not like the larvae at earlier stages are impossible to see. They're just not very obvious. So most people aren't appreciating them as like obviously seeing them in a wound until day 3. Importantly, the female fly will only breed one time in her entire life cycle. That's why the sterile insect technique is so effective and works so well. So if we can present that female fly with a sterilized male fly and she breeds with him, she won't breed again, and all of the eggs she lays won't hatch. So if we can overwhelm the fly population with sterilized males, and most or all of the females breed with the sterilized males, none of the eggs that they lay will hatch, and then that female fly ends her life cycle without contributing to the population. So that's the goal with sterile insect technique. We'll talk a little bit about it more in a minute. Um, we'll see peak fly activity in the mid 80s, but you can definitely see these flies active from the mid to low 60s up until the low 90s, which is unfortunately a lot of the time in North Carolina. That's kind of why we care about it. The pupal stage can really extend quite far. So when you get that perfect amount of heat and humidity, which is kind of in the low 80s with a good amount of humidity, that life cycle can be as short as 18 days. So from the adult fly hatching from the pupae to turning around and the next pupae hatching can be really short, but it can also be a couple months long if it's cool enough ambient temperature that that pupae doesn't hatch right away. And that pupal stage is really only going to be killed if the soil temp is consistently below 46 degrees Fahrenheit, which is pretty cold for a soil temperature. So they have the capability to overwinter, even if it's cold enough outside to not support adult fly behavior, they'll overwinter. That's why we don't see flies, our normal native flies, in the wintertime, but they're all back again in the summer. They're overwintering. The fly prefers a wooded area, but they'll definitely seek out some hosts and pastures if they're available. They'll generally fly within a 2-mile range. So the fly doesn't want to fly very far. If there are plenty of hosts available, and the weather and environment are good, they're not really going to leave. So if they've got perfect environment and perfect weather and perfect hosts, they're really not going to go far at all. They've been known to reliably travel about 12 miles. Same thing, looking for hosts, decent weather. You'll see people talk about how far they can fly. They've been known to fly pretty far, but that's arid environment, cold environment, no hosts. Like if they really have to seek out a host, they're capable of flying long distances, but they really don't. Which is why we'll talk about the infested zones and the sizing and choosing of those, and that's based on fly behavior. And then I had a picture of the dashboard, but what I'm actually going to do is go back to the website here. So this is the USDA's dashboard of confirmed detections in the US, and I think they're at least updating this once a day on a weekday. So this is, I think, the best place to go to see everything that the USDA is currently reporting. And you can see Dr. Martin, oh, it's up, it's updating. Dr. Martin talked about these 2 cases in Zavala County, Texas. That's kind of how that was the first detection, was that first calf case in Zavala County. It was a calf, it was a beef calf with a infestation in the umbilicus, so the navel. Which was also exactly what was happening with the second detection, which was also a second calf with an umbilical or a navel infestation. So that's a good example of a perfect spot for the fly. That nice, wet, fresh umbilicus is prime for a fly to find and lay eggs at. That little bitty young calf doesn't really have a lot of defenses to protect its navel. And that's a good example of how a little bit more aggressive the screwworm fly is from our native flies. So we're not normally seeing a lot of maggot infested umbilical lesions in North Carolina if they're not already like infected and have some other underlying component first. But the screwworm seems to like a calf navel. So those 2 detections Like Dr. Martin said, it really, um, once we heard about the first detection, it seemed to indicate that there may be a population of flies in the area because that calf was born there and hadn't left, right? So it got its infestation on site, so it was uh, kind of leaning towards there's probably a population of flies around. So this second calf was less than 6 miles away. That kind of makes sense. You kind of expect to find more cases when you're looking really actively for them. Then yesterday, I think we got word about these detections. If you heard, you may have heard about the New Mexico dog case. I think it was initially reported as a Texas case. And it makes sense if you realize the dog is from New Mexico, but it went to a vet clinic in Texas, so it was in Texas when it was confirmed. But the dog is actually from New Mexico because I guess it lives right on the line there, so it's counting towards the New Mexico detection. And then the today, I think these two cases popped up. So another calf. I had the press release about this case doesn't specify if it's a naval infection, but it's another calf in this adjoining county over here. And then there's a goat up here in Gillespie County. So, no, not a lot of details about this goat or even this dog case yet as far as epidemiology goes. I think we're kind of hoping that they're movement cases. But these were kind of pretty comfortable that there's a population of flies locally. Oh, yep, Dr. Martin, if you want to
Yeah. No,
chime
and
in.
just wanted to interject on this and
Yeah.
spot on perfect, Dr. Thompson. In historically, when we're dealing with disease situations like this and early in stages, I just want everybody to be prepared for that. We have historically had things that kind of evolve over time. So as new information comes to light, then the story kind of changes a little bit. And so we're getting some preliminary information about epidemiology of these cases, but there's still a lot to learn. So what we're seeing currently on the dashboard and everything like that is all great information. I would just say that if you see information that starts to change or it starts to evolve, that's part and parcel of the epidemiological process for disease outbreaks like this. So we're going to work with the data that we've got from USDA, and that's the way we're kind of like looking at this problem. But we and I would recommend for all of you remain flexible because it's pretty much inevitable new information will come to light and it'll give us a little bit more of the story and we'll have to kind of go from there and decide how to go. So just wanted to interject that. Thank you, Dr. Thompson.
Yeah, thanks, Doc. Um, and then I'll switch to this is the website from the Texas Animal Health Commission. This is their kind of live map of infested zones. So right now, these are the only ones I think that are updated on the map, which is that Zavala and LaSalle counties. The Texas is not
Hey,
completely
you worry about you. You got enough stuff to take care of.
this isn't completely out of the realm of normal for Texas to have to deal with quarantine zones and movement restrictions. They deal with cattle fever tick quarantines pretty commonly, which also include movement restrictions. So, what they have done, what they did after the very first detection, was to set up a movement restriction for 72 hours. So you may have heard that nothing was being allowed to move out of the infested zones. That was only for 72 hours and only after the first detection. So things are able to move now under a very specific set of movement requirements. We'll talk about those in just a minute. And the infested zones are based on a couple different things. They're based on location, right? Both of these infested zones have two detections in them. So how big the infested zone is, it's required to be a minimum of 20 kilometers from the detection, but it doesn't have to stay minimum. So depending on weather, host density, habitat, they might make the infested zone bigger. So if you're used to dealing with zones with diseases, we tend to have them look like more perfect circles just due to viruses. This is different. This is a pest. So like you might have an infested zone that looks kind of wonky shaped. That's because they're really evaluating the local habitat when they make their infested zones. The adjacent surveillance zone Animals in the adjacent surveillance zone can move freely, but this is considered a pretty heavy surveillance zone for flies and for animals. So they're going to be doing a lot of like passive surveillance in this zone, a lot of education to people living in the blue zone. Look at your animals every day, report anything that you find. They're going to be doing a heavy amount of fly trapping in the zone, trying to make sure that we don't have active screwworms outside of the infested zones. And then they'll be doing quite a bit. They're already doing quite a bit of surveillance. We'll talk about that in a minute. Along the borders, and then in strategic areas across the whole southern border from California all the way to Texas. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. As far as movements are concerned, this is the Texas Animal Health Commission website right now. So right now, all the warm-blooded animals that want to move out of the infested zone, you should contact Texas Animal Health Commission to set up an inspection. So right now, their inspections are animal health officials only, and then they will fill out the inspection. They'll do the inspection and they'll fill out a certificate that says, yes, I inspected these animals. I didn't see any screwworms, and they've been treated. So they do have to have a treatment with a product used for prevention or treatment. It has to be an approved product. There are differences between pesticides and drugs. We'll get to that a little bit later too, as to who approves. So there's a list of things that are approved to use as treatment before moving. So it needs to be treated with one of those things. And then that certificate needs to go with the animal as they move out of the infested zone. Like I said, Texas has done the whole quarantine area treatment, control thing certificates before. So they've actually set up roadblocks and inspections with their livestock inspectors. So they're checking certificates as things are moving out of the area. There is some allowance in the USDA Green Book and Playbook as far as screwworm response that allows for certified inspectors to do inspections. And it sounds like Texas is working on getting a certification process for inspectors up and running. So I don't anticipate that it'll stay to animal health officials. I think there'll be some certification programs for other folks to get certified. And then I think I'm going to move back to see if I can get back to my PowerPoint slide without completely hijacking my whole thing here. Hey, I think that worked. This is an example of one of those infested zones from some of the preparedness documents. Like we were talking about, they're not going to be perfect circles. They're going to be different sizes. They're going to be kind of wonky shaped. And it all comes down to what is best for fly habitat. And like we said, they can make them bigger. So we might see that they have them border like a river because that's an easy zone to have movement restrictions on one side of the river, but not on the other. Try to kind of limit like cutting a ranch in half and okay, cows on this side need an inspection, cows on this side don't. Trying to probably kind of eliminate that kind of thing. We talked about the adjacent surveillance zone where they're doing both fly surveillance and animal surveillance. And then this bigger, broader, they're going to be doing fly surveillance pretty far out to try to make sure we're not missing something outside of that tighter surveillance zone. So this is actually total confirmed cases in Mexico, across the Mexico outbreak. And you can see cattle lead their confirmed case count by far and away, which kind of makes sense. They've been running about 60 to 70% of the total confirmed cases so far this outbreak. But a third of those cattle cases that are reported in are umbilical lesions in calves. So it does match up with what we've seen in Texas so far, several calf umbilical lesions so far. So that wet kind of early umbilicus seems to be prime for screwworm. And then you can see dogs are actually next. Mexico does have quite a few kind of like a feral dog population, at least dogs that are very prone to fighting and not on preventatives. So but likely to encounter a human to provide some sort of intervention and then get it tested and reported. And then pigs and horses follow. So again, a lot of outdoor swine, not as much indoor commercial swine like we have here. Um, and they have quite a few sheep and goats, and you can see they kind of follow. So I'm going to talk about eradication a little bit briefly. We've had it here before. Depending on how old you are, you may or may not have any memory of it being here before. Um, it's been eradicated from the southeast, since the late 50s, and it's really been mostly eradicated from the US since the 60s. There were outbreaks in Texas in the 70s. I think it's in this eradication map that obviously still says 66, there was an incursion up from Mexico in the 70s that they were able to kind of turn around and push back down. Um, and to really do a good job of eradication, it took quite a bit of time and it took quite a bit of flies. So you can appreciate like it from the 1972 they were able to kind of draw a line here, and then it took until 1984 to really get it down here to this narrow part of Mexico, and then it took quite a few more years, took till 2001 to get it all the way down to Panama, which the barrier maintained great from 2001 up until a couple of years ago. We'll talk about that in a little minute, but this is currently there's only one facility producing sterile flies, and it's in Panama. So it was producing sterile flies to hold the barrier down here in Panama. Over time, because the barrier was very effective for a very long time, any other production facilities, up here have been shut down, for a number of years at this point because the one facility in Panama was able to produce enough flies to hold the barrier really well. So right now that's still the only production facility. They're capable of producing about 100 million flies a week. Flies are raised in the facility and then irradiated to make them sterile. And then they're shipped out by plane to dispersal facilities where they're then either dispersed by ground release chamber or by air. So this is a picture of a ground release chamber. I think this is from Florida, had a little incursion in 2017. I think this is a Florida picture. And then this is from some of the aerial dispersal earlier in the Mexico outbreak. So you can see the flight paths of the airplanes as they're dropping these pupae. And then they hatch and they're sterile flies. And then the male sterile flies, like we said, breeds, hopefully, with the female wild type fertile fly, and then none of her eggs hatch. So we're going to talk through the New Mexico outbreak real quick. I just want you to appreciate just give everybody an idea of how fast it really did travel. And then I want to kind of drive the point home that that's not necessarily because the fly flies far, right? The fly would much prefer to stay in a pretty small area. Most of this like big jumps in movement have been kind of down to animals moving with active live larvae on them. So animal moves with larvae in a wound, animal gets to where it's going, north in this case, and the larvae exit the wound, pupate, and then we have a fly population where that animal wound up at. So it first jumped the barrier in 2022 in Panama. Historically, Panama had, one or two small breaks and detections every year. It's not uncommon for Panama to have a handful of detections on the wrong side of the barrier, and they've always been able to suppress them with like localized targeted fly release until 2022. So 2022 got away from them. There's a bunch of reasons for that. One of the reasons was during 2022, they think they had a less effective fly strain. They're constantly doing research and checks, making sure that all the steps that they take to sterilize the fly doesn't affect how hardy the fly is in the wild so that it wants to breed with female fly. Sounds like maybe we had a little bit less efficacy that year. There's also been some more animal movement up from South America where this fly is endemic, and especially grazing and kind of putting pressure on the sterile fly barrier there in Panama. So jumped the barrier in 2022. By 2023, it was in Costa Rica. And by 2024, it swept through Honduras, Guatemala, and then we had a southern Mexico detection in November of 2024. So the first case in Mexico was down here in Chiapas. And then by January, February, it was up to kind of this narrow landmass in Mexico. They call that the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. Isthmus just means narrow landmass. Tehuantepec is there in Mexico. So this is when they kind of tried to establish a buffer zone. They were like, okay, this is the narrowest landmass that we've got an opportunity at stopping the flies at. The experts at that time were thinking, okay, well, we could, but it's probably going to take about 200 million flies a week to really have a good barrier, and we only have 100 million. So we've got about half as many flies as we really need to establish a strong barrier. But we're going to try. So it worked for a little while. By April and May, we were kind of getting some detections up here into the southern part of Oaxaca and Veracruz, so kind of adjusting the sterile fly barrier back a little bit. And then there was a big kind of breach in this barrier on May 7th. That's that kind of loner out here. So it was 127 miles past where the buffer zone had been established. In reaction to that, livestock imports through the land ports in Mexico were closed. So we import a fair amount of Mexican beef that was closed. You could still import horses, but only by air. So couldn't import horses by land port either. Just to make sure we weren't going to like completely lose control of everything. Everything was quiet for a little while. Seemed like the barrier was kind of holding. So it was like, okay, we're going to try to phase reopen the land ports one at a time, starting with the furthest away. That didn't last very long because we had this detection in northern Veracruz. So again, this is another animal movement. Animal moved with larvae on board, and then we, had a detection that's pretty far up there. At this point, this was the closest in July of last year, 370 miles from the border. In response to that, stopped the phase reopening, and the ports still remain closed to livestock import today. By August, this is kind of what we were looking at. You can see the little green, right? This is where they were dropping sterile flies at. This is where they were dropping sterile flies over that northern Veracruz detection. And then this is September. So I don't know if you can really appreciate it. It had kind of moved back a little bit by September. There was another real far north detection. There's a feedlot up here in Nuevo Leon, so an animal moved from Veracruz up there with larvae on board. And then this is January of this year. So you can see our nice kind of clean swath of flies had kind of gotten broken up. We were kind of targeting at this point, we knew we didn't have enough flies. And Mexico's getting pretty wide, right, at the point that they were trying to kind of cover. So they decided to be very targeted with their sterile fly release and focus on the areas that the flies were most likely to be. Get the most amount of suppression out of the minimum amount of flies that we had. The fly, like we said, likes warm and likes humid. This was January. This middle part of Mexico is kind of mountainy, kind of arid, not great fly habitat. So they really focused on the coasts where it's going to be more warmer, more humid, and more livestock. This was March of this year. So you can see at this point, kind of abandoned getting across of Mexico, kind of letting this coast be what it will be, and doing everything possible to really slow the northern spread up into the US. So doing everything that we can at this point to slow progression to give USDA and Texas time to prepare. At this point, we were releasing some sterile flies into the US as a kind of an abundance of caution. So we've been doing that for several months at this point. And then this was May. So you can see covering more of the Texas-Mexico border, but our depth is a little shallower when it comes to sterile fly release. Starting to get some more detections up here, kind of close to the border, within 100 miles of the border. And then this is from last week. You can actually see the sterile flies released over the Texas detection. And then the amount that they're trying to, like, we're starting to get some cases out here, and we're just basically running out of flies. So it's pretty incredible the amount of suppression that they're able to do with the small amount of flies that they have. I think they're releasing 4 million out of that 100 million just right over here in that part of Texas. That was announced after the Zavala County. I'm not sure how many more will be released with this new LaSalle County. So, to give you an idea of where we're at with sterile fly production, I mentioned that there's only one operational facility that's in Panama, and that's doing 100 million flies a week. They are working on converting a fruit fly, sterile fruit fly plant in Mexico. So USDA provided quite a bit of money to kind of get that plant retrofitted. It's on track to be done. It should be done this month. I expected them to announce the opening really soon, but it's going to take some time to establish brood and ramp up production. So I think they're on target to hit 100 million flies a week by the end of the year. So it's going to take a few months before we can add a lot more flies to the fight. The next facility that we're working on is actually in Texas. So there used to be a sterile fly facility in Edinburgh, Texas, the first time we eradicated New World screwworm. So they broke ground on this facility. It's under construction. Their initial production target is to get to 100 million flies a week by November of next year. Everybody's trying to push that target up so that maybe we can get flies before next summer. But the current production target is 100 million flies by November. And then it'll take another year to really ramp up to max production capacity. So they're expecting to get to total of 3 million out of this production facility, but that won't be till late in the year 2028. So we have potential for 500 million flies by December 2028, which is what it took to eradicate screwworm the last time. Now we have a lot better technology in 2026 than we did in the 1960s. So I think they've proven that with the amount of effect that they've been able to get out of just 100 million flies in the past year in Mexico. So cautiously optimistic that it won't take this long to eradicate them this time. A quick note about dispersal facilities. I think this part's interesting, right? We mentioned that the current production facilities in Panama, well, we're releasing flies way up here in northern Mexico and the US. So you got to get them from Panama all the way up here, and then you've got to get them into whatever vehicle, whether that's a small craft airplane or in a ground release chamber. So there's a handful of dispersal facilities. There's one way down here in southern Mexico. We're not really using that one anymore. Most everything's getting flown out of Tampico, which is in Mexico, or Texas. So interestingly, the flies are dyed. So they are shipped in that pupal stage because they can refrigerate them and slow down when they will hatch. When they get to the dispersal facility, they're received off the plane, they're dyed, so we know which dispersal facility they came from, and then they're repacked into whatever their release method of choice is, whether that's aerial or ground. So each dispersal facility gets their own dye color, and then when they're trapped, because there's quite a big trapping and surveillance effort underway, it's easy to identify where it got released from, and that helps them decide like how far are our flies flying, how hardy are they, all that good thing. So there's thousands of traps. There's traps across Mexico's. There's traps, like I said, from Canada to Texas. There's quite a bit of targeted trapping right around that detection in Texas. Some of these are screwworm specific traps. Some of these are modified traps for other insects. They're checked very regularly. They're picking up quite a few flies. And then any suspicious flies are checked to see if they're screwworm or not, and then they're checked to see if they're sterile or not. Also in the works, which you may have heard about in the news, is what they're calling the Novo fly. This would just be a way to have male-only flies produced at the production facility. So right now, they don't have a way to do that. They're producing 50-50 males and females. And you've really only heard me talking about the males because those are the only ones that we really need, and those are the only ones that we can use to any effect. Releasing sterile female flies don't help. They don't hurt anything, but they don't help anything either. So if we could get a way to release only sterile males, that would effectively double the production capacity of a facility. So we could really increase the amount of usable flies we could get out of the facilities that we have. So that's waiting on EPA approval. Hopefully that'll come soon. Sounds promising. Now I'm going to talk about signs and symptoms a little bit. I touched on it briefly, but things that we want to think of that make us think screwworm versus regular run-of-the-mill maggots in a wound. So remember, it's pretty easy to see the larva by day 3. They feed on living tissue, which means this creates a different discharge than we normally see with a maggot-infested wound. So bloody discharge. Also think of like worsening or enlarging wounds or wounds with a really small skin surface entry point and then a really big wound underneath. That's not really normal maggot behavior, but that is classic screwworm behavior. And they're supposed to release a really foul odor. So, screwworm larvae apparently release a pheromone that smells really bad. I've never smelled it. I mean, maggot-infested wounds don't smell great, but these are supposed to be very like a hallmark smell if you've smelled it enough and get used to it. So that's something else to kind of keep in mind. These are the major clinical signs that they talk about for screwworm: depressed, off feed, isolated from the herd. Those are all kind of normal, my animal feels bad signs. The head shaking is a little specific though, because remember we talked about if they can't find a small wound, they'll take a mucosal surface like the eyes, the nose, or the ears. So some of those animals present as head shaking, like their head is really irritated, and it's due to a maggot infestation either in their nose or their ears. How many animals are affected really depends on the time of year as well as some other conditions. So they'll take a wound as small as a tick bite. So tick season is bad. You'll see a lot of injuries in male whitetail during the rut. They're injuring themselves during the rut. It's still warm enough to be active fly season. Conversely, you'll see a lot of fawns during the fawn season. Same wet, unprotected umbilicus story as the calves. With livestock, there's a lot of management activities that we undergo with our livestock that create a small injury in the skin, which isn't normally a problem, but can be for screwworm. So some of the management things that we can control, applying good preventions at that time can help prevent a screwworm infestation. And then it's fatal within a couple weeks if left untreated because there's nothing to stop the advancement of those larvae burrowing in. They'll either hit a major organ system or the animal will become septic if no treatments are taken. But it's very treatable. So the nice thing about this is if you're finding it and you can't, if you didn't prevent it, but you find it and you treat it, animals recover really, really well. So preventions to take during an outbreak and the unfortunate event that we have to deal with this here. What are we going to do? Doubling up on our fly preventions, like really doubling down, I should say, on fly prevention and inspection. So routinely looking for wounds and then being really cognizant when we're doing something that creates a wound to protect that wound from fly infestation. Geldings and stallions, I'll mention that really briefly, doing routine sheath inspections. Like the whole thing about the fly, if they can't find a wound, they'll take a mucosal surface. That sheath seems to be a pretty happy habitat for that fly to lay an egg on. So routine inspections there is ideal. And then anything that we can put outside of the fly season, let's put out of the fly season. Like all of those things. If at all possible, we either need to put them outside of the fly season or we need to put some fly control on them. I'll touch briefly on treatments. So there are drug treatments and there are EPA registered pesticides for prevention and control. We don't have any fully approved drug treatments for screwworm in the US right now because we haven't had it in a really long time. So none of the current walking around drug labels have a screwworm label. However, FDA does have some conditional approvals and some emergency use authorizations. They have a website where they show all of the things with conditional approvals and all of the things with emergency use authorizations. The difference between a conditional approval and a full approval is just the difference between a reasonable expectation of efficacy versus a substantial expectation of efficacy. So most everything's probably going to be a conditional approval for a while. Dectomax, I'm picking on them because they have a conditional and they have an emergency use and they have a full label, right? So Dectomax injectable for cattle has a label. So all the label things still apply. Route of administration, dose, meat withdrawal, but it has a conditional approval as well as an emergency use authorization. So the language for the conditional approval and the EUA are a little bit different, and then the species are different. So it has a full conditional approval for cattle, and then you'll see dairy cattle is over here on the emergency use authorization. I also want to point out that these conditional and emergency use authorizations do not extend to the ingredient. It's just the product. So, like a generic doramectin would not have a conditional approval unless it went through the FDA approval process. So, approved use, like FDA approved use, conditional use EUA, doesn't necessarily mean that another product won't work, but it's not on our list of things that are approved to use as a treatment prior to movement. So it's really important to work with your veterinarian for selection of a treatment. And then this is also available online. It's available on our website. We've got links to all these things on our website. It's pesticides for the control of New World screwworm. So if it's pesticide, if it's not a drug, it falls under EPA instead of FDA. So you got to go to this to find the EPA things and the FDA to find the FDA things. These are registered under FIFRA and get some 2EE exemptions. If you're into the pesticide game, you probably understand what I just said. If you're not, you don't, that's okay. We're working with our NCDA pesticide folks here in North Carolina, as well as, like Dr. Martin mentioned, we've been working with South Carolina. We've also been kind of meeting routinely with them and some other southern states to try to get us all on the same page about these FIFRA exemptions and get bulletins for products that would qualify so that we all kind of hopefully have very similar approved lists of treatments in the event that we need them for movement. So, important points. Don't try to distinguish between New World screwworm and native flies and maggots in the field. They just look really similar. Only one of these is screwworm. The other two are normal blowflies. So don't get too freaked out if you see a fly with red eyes, because we've got a lot of those already. But you'll see pictures of them in news and media. So just kind of brace yourself. They just look very similar to our flies if you're not an entomologist. And remember that wounds are likely to have, if we ever get screwworm here, that we will probably have both types of maggots in there. So looking at the maggots is not a reliable way to figure out if you're dealing with screwworm or not. We want to focus more on wound characteristics and maybe history for that animal. So is there a bloody discharge? How big is the wound versus the wound opening? How bad does it smell? A little bad or a lot bad? And then do I have a gelding with maggots in the sheath that just came from Texas? I'm probably going to be pretty worried about that, right? So maggots somewhere where they don't belong and an animal that's recently moved here, or a really bloody discharge. So those are the things that are going to really raise a red flag. And then remember, this is preventable, it's treatable, it's curable. So it's listed as a foreign animal disease, right? It's a reportable foreign animal disease, but this is a pest, so it's much different than a lot of the other foreign animal diseases. And the control methods that we would use for those, we're not anticipating any great amount of death loss with this particular pest, right? This is something that's treatable and curable. And then controlling movement of larvae is critical. So that's how it spreads so fast, in spite of, mitigation efforts with the sterile fly release, is because of animals kind of leapfrogging past the barrier and establishing flies ahead of the barrier. So controlling movement of the larva, like infested wounds, is going to be critical. And that's why these movement controls out of infested zones are so important. And then I want to make sure y'all know who to call if you suspect. So obviously first, always want you guys to call your local veterinarian. If you can't get your vet, if you don't have a vet, you can call us. So anybody can call to report. We really encourage you to call your vet first and have them assess and collect and then have them call us. But there are numbers if you can't. There's both NCDA number and the USDA number for North Carolina. And then I wanted to bring this up. I'll show you numbers again in a minute if you're trying to write them down and you didn't. This is screwworm.gov. So that USDA confirmed cases dashboard that I showed you, you can get that from here. You can actually link to the Texas website from here. And they've got a lot of really nice resources on all the things I just talked about, all the things that we worry about, all the things to look for. And then depending on who you are, if you're a, livestock producer, if you're a veterinarian, they've kind of got can direct you to where you need to go for what you're looking for. And then I'm going to leave this up for a minute. Those are the two numbers again. And this is a QR code to sign up for our email. This is our general diseases and disasters alert email. But we'll be sending kind of semi-routine updates as things are confirmed to that email moving forward. So I'm not sure how many of these types of meetings we'll have. I'm going to try to kind of keep everybody as updated as I can on there. And with that, I think we'll open it up to questions, and I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Martin, if you want to say anything else to end.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, before we get into questions, and thank you very much, Dr. Thompson. That was a really wonderful overview of the current status and the disease process, infestation process itself. But before we get into questions, Dr. Lalitha Petaretti from our Rollins Diagnostic Lab did have some information she was sharing with me, and I'll just, if you wouldn't mind, Dr. Petty-Ready, if you could just kind of come off mute and maybe just share some of the lab's timing and perspectives as far as sample handling as it pertains to the National Veterinary Services Lab. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Martin. That was great information. Thanks, Dr. Thompson. Hey, everyone, this is Dr. Petty-Reddy. I am Assistant Director at Rollins Diagnostic Lab. I just want to provide a quick update on how we will be handling any suspect samples in our lab. For instructions from our National Reference Laboratory, all the New World screwworm suspect samples, the larvae or flies that are submitted to our lab for identification, we are required to forward to National Reference Laboratory within 24 hours. So if you have any suspect case and plan to submit the samples to the lab, please make sure to first communicate with those Dr. Thompson just mentioned and give a heads up to the lab and keep lab management in loop. So I just wanted to pass this information to you guys.
Thank you very much, Dr. Petty-Ready. Okay, we are in the question and answer portion of this, and we do have a lot of questions that have built up online. So I'll be reading some of those out loud. I might take a first crack at some of these things, but then I'll be definitely turning over to Dr. Thompson on it in case she has any follow-up content or information on these questions. So Dr. Thompson, you can just kind of listen, be ready, and I'll fill in as you're thinking about the answers as well. So our first question was, will the eggs hatch immediately when exposed to water, as fly strike does? So there is no evidence that I have seen or heard of that water actually facilitates the hatching of these eggs. And so that there's nothing that I've seen where water facilitates hatch. Dr. Thompson, I don't know if you had any other thoughts on that question.
No other thoughts. I think the main thing to note for that is if you are looking at a wound and you think you have enough characteristics, like you're looking at a wound and you're worried about screwworm, um, collecting all of the larvae that are flushed is recommended, so that we can ensure that they are killed before they contact the soil. So that would be recommended for any wound treatment anyway. But especially in a case if you're suspicious of New World screwworm, it's not so much a matter of what you flush them out with. It's a matter of catching and collecting them so that we can ensure that they are killed either with like alcohol is preferable, 70% isopropyl alcohol. You can't flush a wound with that. But if you collect the larvae and soak them in alcohol, you can ensure that they won't.
Excellent. Next question is, what do you advise to prevent calves from getting these on its umbilical cord area? In general, I think right during, just constant assessment of any wounds, whether it be umbilical wounds or anything like that, is going to be a good thing, and keeping that site clean is going to be probably the number one thing. When you're looking at treatments in general, I would say, and this is going to go to a lot of these treatment protocols and treatment questions that are on this thread. As this potential infestation outbreak grows, there may be a strain on the existing pesticides that are available for use. So we want to try to be very judicious and thoughtful on these treatments. And so as this progresses, some of these things might change. I think keeping up to information on screwworm.gov on that website, we will have information on our website as well. But in general, having a nice established relationship with the veterinarian and asking them about treatment protocols, dips, and stuff like that for umbilical cords is probably going to be your best bet. And then that way you're staying current as an issue comes up, because this is potentially a thing that will change over time, especially depending on availability of various medications that are available. Dr. Thompson, anything you'd like to add on that?
Nothing to add. I strongly suggest you talk to your veterinarian to develop a protocol. Generally speaking, dipping navels has been generally recommended just because it speeds up the drying process to shorten the window that they would be susceptible to fly strike anyway.
Excellent. Next question. What are the earliest behavioral changes in humans, livestock, or pets that should prompt a hands-on wound inspection or concern that they have been exposed to to screwworms? There was some stuff that Dr. Thompson gave as far as, clinical presentation of these animals. There are reports of the animals potentially, separating themselves out from the rest of the animals in the animal population, from the rest of the herd and such. However, I think that, when you're looking at the eggs being laid on these wounds and then the time from those eggs to hatch and start digging into tissue, realistically, I think it's just an overall assessment of these animals on a routine basis, looking for wounds, making sure those wounds are cleaned properly and treated on a regular basis, especially if you end up in an infested zone. Really routine, hands on the animal, looking for wounds, keeping them clean, keeping them nice and tidy is going to go a long way as far as the prevention in this. Dr. Thompson, anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, no, I think generally speaking, the messaging has been pretty strong to watch for wounds. So we're hoping to find it at the susceptible wound stage rather than the wound is so bad that the animal's displaying adverse clinical signs. So that's what we're hoping for, is getting everybody keeping their eyes on their animals for susceptible wounds, especially in high-risk areas.
Excellent. Dr. Carl Williams, our public health state veterinarian, added a web link onto the chat looking at a clinical overview of human screwworm infestation. And so if you're interested in the human aspects of a screwworm infestation, I highly recommend to go to that CDC web link that Dr. Williams provided on our chat. Next question. So if we knew 2 to 3 years ago that, and I'm going to clarify based upon the question's rephrasing, if we knew 2 to 3 years ago that 100 million sterile fly production wasn't going to work, why have the U.S. facilities not been put back into sterile fly production 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 1 year ago now? Why are we not using SWAS? I'm not sure what SWAS is. But the gist of it is I think that there was a progression of this as it moved further and further north. And realistically, when it when the screwworms populations entered into Mexico, it really became apparent that the current production of flies was definitively not handling the situation from the standpoint of that national strategy. And so there could be hindsight is 2020, and maybe there should have been some production things that could have happened sooner. But that's really where the emphasis came into it. And honestly, the way that when they knew that they didn't have enough screwworms to mitigate against the spread of it, there was some creative strategies last year that were implemented that stretched that 100 million per week fly production out and actually defied modeling that showed that last summer it was going to get into the United States. And what that did is it did buy some time at least to look at the production facility that's in Mexico, which was a fruit fly production facility and has been now modified to a New World screwworm production facility. And realistically, the U.S. Production facilities were decommissioned so many years ago. The construction of the Texas facility is happening from scratch. And it just takes a long time to build the infrastructure and build the fly populations up and have all of your staff that would be able to man that and operate that and make the production facilities go. So unfortunately, starting from scratch in these areas like Mexico and definitely in the United States, where it's definitely from scratch there, it just takes time. So fortunately, the way the fly populations were used in that interim did buy us some time, but we are definitely behind the 8 ball a bit, and that is going to mean that we're going to be having this in the United States for a little while at least. Dr. Thompson, anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, I'll answer this SWAS question. That's the bait and kill with bait strategy. Historically, they did use that. They didn't really start using it until it was about in Texas during the eradication. So the problem now with that is the bait is not up to EPA snuff anymore. So the old bait, I think, is classified as a carcinogen. I'm pretty sure it's an organophosphate. So we're a little bit more, EPA is a little bit more worried about, I guess, or we have more research about things and their impacts on human health and, advantage insect populations, good insect populations than we did in the 60s. So those won't pass EPA regs now. They've been doing research into the lure, an effective lure and bait, but don't have anything ready to deploy from a SWAS side. But we were able to eradicate the whole southeast in Florida with just sterile insect techniques. So it won't surprise me if we get an approved SWAS and start adding it in eventually. They just don't have anything that's ready to deploy at the moment. I think that's.
And I would just add on to that a lot of the older products that were used back in the 60s had negative impact on pollinators. And that's something that's part of the reason why they're not available for use in this day and age. Okay, next question. Can they ramp up the current existing facility, this is the one in Puerto Rico, to get to more than 100 million flies per week, production per week? So these facilities have the ability to ramp up until they hit a capacity for the facility. And unfortunately, 100 to 110 million per week for the Puerto Rican facility is the max capacity. So there's not really any ability with the existing infrastructure in Puerto Rico to ramp up from there. But they are going to be looking at the Mexico facility of getting some fly production before they reach their max capacity there, which to my understanding is 100 million per week at that facility. And again, when you're looking at the time frame for the Texas facility, they're looking at the end of next year for reaching 100 million flies per week production, but then the year after that for getting up to 300 million flies per week. So some of it is there is ability to ramp up, but some of it is that there's just an absolute cap at these facilities based upon the size and logistic footprint. Dr. Thompson, anything you want to add there?
Yeah, no, you covered it. The Panama facility, Puerto Rico facility, I think you misspoke. Just to clarify for everybody. But
Yeah, sorry.
yeah, 100 is their ramped up. That was not their normal. So that's max. Yeah.
Yes, Panama, not Puerto Rico. Yes, yes, yes. The next question. I have cattle in Bowie, Texas. If one of them ends up with it, does the animal get treated or condemned? If I send slaughter, will frozen meat be prevented from export from the state? Are the treatments currently offered safe for meat animals? What is the withdrawal? So a lot of different things going on in there. In general, animals that are infested don't have to be depopulated and necessarily terminated and never go to production. But if the animal is healthy enough to survive treatment, they can go through a treatment protocol and recover after this. And so now there's product that goes to slaughter. That's under a different standard than we have for animals that are going interstate movement because there are withdrawal times based upon the specific medications. So this is, again, one of those questions where, especially if you're in Texas, because Texas has their own protocols that they're following right now, this is one of those situations where you'd want to be working closely with your veterinarian in Texas, as well as the Texas Animal Health Commission, making sure that they are being provided a treatment that is accepted by the Texas Animal Health Commission, used in appropriate fashion, assuming that it's available and it's not, understocked because everybody's using it up. And then following withdrawal times very, very closely on whatever product is being recommended by your veterinarian or the Texas Animal Health Commission at the time. So that would be very situational. I would say that depending on where we are at the time, if your animals did break, you would just want to be closely working with your veterinarian in Texas and the Texas Animal Health Commission. Dr. Thompson, any other thoughts on that one?
I think you covered it. Yeah. The earlier you find it and the earlier you report it and the earlier you treat it, the earlier everything resolves anyway. So that's always going to be key. Yeah.
Yeah. Next question. Females only breed one time. Do males only breed one time after the steriles just hooking up with each other? So no, to the best of my knowledge, the male flies are relatively prolific, and that's part of the advantage of this strategy is that then, those males being males, they'll get around to more female flies, even though the female flies are only having a single breeding in their life cycle. Dr. Thompson, anything to add on that one?
Nope, covered.
Okay. Next question. Did production facilities start being ramped back up after the barrier was broken in 2022? I think I kind of covered that question already with what I answered. Dr. Thompson, anything more to add on that one?
Nope.
Okay, next question. Will they be attracted to the dubbing area on a calf's head, like when they knock off the scab off and stuff? Should I spray the calves down with fly spray each week? How to prevent? So any wound, and this is even to the size of a needle injection site, can be something that could attract these flies to lay eggs at the site. So definitely any wound that side would be an attractant. And I would definitely be, again, working with your veterinarian very closely on preventative treatments and stuff for procedures like this, like we talked about with the umbilical cords. All those things would be stuff that right now would be a good time to start talking to your veterinarian about how that would look for your animals given your environment. Dr. Thompson, anything you want to add there?
Nope, I think you covered.
Great. Next question. What are the requirements for declaring an area free in the wildlife? A certain amount of time without flies and traps, a certain amount of time not seeing the larvae during surveillance. So I'm going to tell you guys up front, I don't necessarily have a great answer for this one. I think that these situations are constantly evolving. I do know that the trapping process is a part of their surveillance, but when it gets to wildlife, it's just very challenging because you don't have the ability to have constant supervision and see all the animals in a given geographic region. So I know that fly traps are a part of the process for a surveillance area. And that surveillance of the region, as it depends on wildlife, could be one that evolves and changes over time as we learn more. But Dr. Thompson, do you have any more thoughts or knowledge on that?
No, I think you covered it. Like I think there's definitely guidelines on infested zone release. I think we'll learn more with now that we have a domestic detection, now that we have detections in infested zones in Texas, and see how any wildlife detections evolve with those and how they impact those zone releases. But that'll be interesting to see how it develops moving forward. Yeah.
Yeah. And I agree. And, remember that our last experience with this as being, a major part of the United States, like biological space has been back in the 60s. And so a lot of people are learning a lot of information now with the new technologies and with new strategies. And so it wouldn't surprise me if USDA policies on this evolve over time as they get information from the field. There's a couple of things back to back here. There's a question about including vaccinations, which they may be meaning medications. Just so everybody knows, there's no vaccine for New World Screwworm at this point in time. It's treatments either externally or systemically that would go into it for parasite control. The next question too is, do zazoline preventatives offer any protection in dogs, cats? I am not familiar with that specifically, but I will say that the screwworm.gov website does have information on treatments. We're going to have some treatment information on our website, but working with your veterinarian for your specific animal based upon what's available, based upon whether you need a topical or systemic, all that's something that I would highly tie your veterinarian in with your animals. Dr. Thompson, anything you want to add specifically on that?
Nope, I think you covered it. Yep.
Okay, great. All right. Dr. Ward added a couple of links on there. One was to our North Carolina Department of Ag Vet Division web link for New World Screwworm, which Dr. Thompson was working very hard on just recently as far as trying to get some of that content updated. And we continue to update that. And also we have our public relations people at the Department of Ag now getting involved with that as well and trying to mirror that onto the main Department of Ag website. And so we are going to be developing and growing content over time on our website. And Dr. Ward also added the APHIS website for stopping New World Screwworm, which I have not looked at yet, but I'm sure it's a good site. And again, the screwworm.gov, that's right now the current dashboard and where a lot of good information is. Dr. Thompson, anything else on dissemination of information or other websites that you're aware of?
No, I think if you're on our email list and you're checking our website and you're checking the USDA website, those should be reliable sources of information for y'all. So there's a lot of good info out there. Those are three that I'm at least confident in.
Okay, great. The next question, in your professional opinion, what are the odds of it getting into North Carolina? So I would probably take my $5 bet and buy a drink and say, I don't know. That would be where I go. But I will say this, that given the sterile fly production that we have currently, and given now that the geography of where this fly is now migrating to, we are going to need more sterile flies to be able to really bait this back and kick it out of the United States. And there's going to be a period of time where it's going to have a higher likelihood of spreading into other areas just because we're getting into a wider and wider geographic space that these flies are going into. There's going to be a lot of variables here as far as our effective use of having the population trust the government enough to then report and allow appropriate treatment and reporting and control of this disease. If we have more people not trusting the national strategy and hiding this problem, it's going to make it for even greater and greater likelihood it'll spread to other states like North Carolina. And so we really need people to be paying attention to the information that's out there, working with their state and federal regulators to report out possible cases and be willing to allow us to kind of try to control the infestation where it is and try to treat it and knock it back before it spreads to other areas. So this is going to take a lot of collaboration with people in the field, state government, federal government to kind of contain this as best as we do. And it would not surprise me if eventually it does get into North Carolina before we beat it down. I'm hopeful that it will not get to our state. I would say that given the amount of sterile fly production that we're looking at and possibly could grow even more in the future, this will be something that we should be able to once and again clear from the United States. It just might take some time to do so. Hopefully the knowledge that we gained back in the 50s and the 60s with these programs will help us do it more quickly. And there is an urgency right now and resources being dedicated to sterile fly production, which gives me some cautious optimism as well. But predicting at this point in time, I feel like you're better off paying your money and buying a drink. Dr. Thompson, anything?
I won't throw out a prediction. I think y'all saw the outbreak development through Central America and Mexico and saw how fast it was and how much of that was down to movement of the larva. So I think our likelihood of getting it will come down to how well everyone works together, how well everyone monitors for the pest, especially in high-risk areas, and how fast and how willing everybody is to report it. We did talk about how it's a reportable disease, right? Which I think is scary for a lot of people, and I think it's oh no, what's going to happen? And I hope that this presentation gave you guys a good idea of what would happen if there's a detection. It's, we're still going to let stuff move. We're not going to completely lock down everything. There's just going to be, we're putting some really smart guidelines in place in infested zones to try to keep the fly from spreading as fast as it did through Central America and Mexico. Because it's a foreign animal disease, we've got some very specific sample submission protocols that we have to follow. So, we talked a little bit about sample submission and collecting samples and that type of thing. It's a considered a foreign animal disease, so they've all got to go to the national lab to get approved yay nay if we run it as a foreign animal disease. But that means that y'all don't have to try to figure out any sample submission things, right? You just call us and let us worry about getting samples, shipping samples, and all that. We're going to submit them as foreign animal disease investigations every time for the foreseeable future. So when in doubt, call somebody. So if you're looking at something and you're not sure what you're looking at, call your vet. And if your vet can't get out there, or if you don't have a vet, call us and then let us worry about it from there.
Excellent. Okay, moving on. We keep getting more and more questions added to our list, so we'll see how much we can get through here. This one is, I think, to Dr. Ward. How can we access the recorded version of this?
So we'll download the recording and make any appropriate edits for time, and then I will share that with you guys. And if your folks want to post it on the NCDA site, they can do that. And then we'll also have it posted on our NC State Extension site as well.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Next question. Can you speak to the Texas border being closed to slaughter Texas to Mexico horses? I cannot. Dr. Thompson, do you have any knowledge about movement to slaughter from Texas to Mexico, and that I don't know if the borders are closed or not. I'm
Yeah.
assuming that from this text there is a closure, but
Yeah, livestock imports and other animal imports are closed into Mexico. It just updated on the USDA import page, and it just says until further notice. So I know after we had a detection, there were trade negotiations, and I don't pretend to know how those go, and I don't pretend to have any great working knowledge of how that is. So I imagine they're, working on trade negotiations, which is probably why that phrasing is until further notice. I think they're trying to assess that at the moment.
excellent. Next question. Would you recommend banding versus castration in bull calves as a good prevention practice? And so as any good poultry veterinarian, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Thompson on this one.
No, not necessarily. So talk to your veterinarian. Banding might not necessarily open an immediate wound in the skin like a surgical castration will, but it takes longer to heal. So it's a catch-22. Yeah.
The next question is a clarification on a previous question. My vaccination question is about the entry point, the wound, as a risk factor. And yes, so these flies will be attracted to wounds as small as an injection site. So if there are vaccinations or any other injections that are being administered, especially if you're in an infested area, it would behoove you to be checking that site regularly, keeping it clean, and making sure it's staying free of flies and eggs. I'm just going to move on to the next one because we're still getting more questions. How does the Dectomax injections play into the organic certification? Dr. Thompson, I don't have anything on this one. Do you have anything?
Yeah, so my understanding of organic certification is that anything that you can currently apply for organic certification, I don't think the organic certification is going to give you a pass for treatment. Because I think it's pretty hard to get that certification. So if it's not something that you can already give and remain organic, you're probably not going to get a pass and remain organic. I do know that EPA had some things listed that were, in that organic sphere, and I think it's on that same chart that I showed you guys. I think they said that they're not recommending using those. So I think there's probably some question about efficacy from using it as a treatment/prevention for movement. I hope that answered your question. But I'm pretty sure since Dectomax is a injectable dewormer, I think that would not be approved for organic certification. Don't quote me on that. It's been a minute since I had an organic client in practice.
Next question. So we can't use the products that worked even for a little while because long-term use of them could cause cancer. And yes, sterile flies worked over 12 years. At what cost to us? What will USDA do to offset our losses? Will APHIS classify screwworm strike as predation loss and pay on it? Or are we just up a creek without a paddle? I'm not worried. I've not heard of any indemnity, financial payments or anything that are being offered by USDA associated with New World Screwworm. I would just say that given that there are certain products and stuff that are not labeled for use anymore and they're not available, that's just kind of the way where we're at, unfortunately. And again, with some of these products doing something where it could kill and devastate pollinators, and that could have a massive adverse effect on various crops and stuff like that. It is something that I think is, it's kind of beyond our control at this point in time, but the production of sterile flies is really kind of the long-term goal in this, and I know they will continue to work on pesticides. Next question. What will North Carolina livestock isolation quarantine look like? Should there be detection? Will it be similar to Texas? I'm concerned because the very large deer population on and around my farm, I can't monitor what I can't catch. So yes, the strategy that Texas is implementing right now is kind of the national strategy. We would be probably doing something very similar. We are going to be working with our South Carolina partners on evolving and developing that strategy. We definitely are going to have some concerns about wildlife. They do have concerns about wildlife right now in Texas because it's fawning season. So we're seeing all these umbilical lesions. What's that going to look like with all these baby fawns being born? So all these things are kind of in play, and some of these things will just have to play out over time. But the wildlife species in our population or in our areas are going to be kind of critical. And the whole idea of clearing these infestation things, as of this time, we will be following the USDA playbook on that. Next one, the products with conditional/emergency use do contain isozalazine. I'm gonna butcher that word. I apologize. And there's an FDA thing, and it gives that. So that's just some follow-up information on the dog question as far as those medications. Again, with medications or concerns, I would advise people to work with their veterinarians. And there's no guarantee that any given product is going to be available if this turns into a larger infestation outbreak. Some of these products could get gobbled up and used in different directions, and that's why we're trying to get more and more products approved for use, is so that way we have more tools in the toolbox in case we have any shortages of viable products. Next question. What are the concerns of it getting into a confined pig operation? So I will say that environmentally controlled operations like swine operations and poultry operations tend to, in general, have less of a risk than animals that are just kind of broadly out in the open and having greater access potentially to flies. They're definitely going to still be a risk, especially on the swine side. And so we have, as we're developing North and South Carolina policies, we have specifics that are on swine operations that are unique to swine operations, as we have for the various other animal species. So we are looking at those operations as a unique entity as we are developing our planning. There's more information there about the ISO drug that I'm brutally mispronouncing on this, so I apologize. Would fly-eating vectors be a good method to help eradicate screwworms? I think anything at this point in time would be a good alternative, but I am unaware of anything that is a screwworm fly-eating vector that could be used. Dr. Thompson, are you familiar with anything as far as that strategy would concern?
I'm not familiar with anything, but I'm not an entomologist. They did just have a big push for funding and grant submission for other ideas and other technology. So I think they're going to be USDA will be announcing awards for in that space. So maybe we'll see something come out of that, but I don't know of anything on the horizon.
Excellent. Another one is a comment. Strategies in wildlife will follow the activities and after action reports from the recent Florida key outbreak that was almost entirely in key deer. And that is an outbreak that did occur, between the 1960s, where we cleared the screwworm from the United States, until now, where we've had this recent introduction. We did have a brief introduction in key deer in the Florida Keys. And so there are some, I think the point is well taken. There are some things that we have learned from that particular setting that could be used. The Florida Keys were a little bit unique in that because it's a series of islands and stuff, there's a little bit more sparsity there rather than a big open land mass, which might be more difficult. But that's not to say that there couldn't be information that's learned, and we will definitely use that. And Dr. Mike Short, who's a state veterinarian from Florida, is very vocal on a lot of our National Assembly meetings and stuff, and provides a lot of good information and content from his experiences with New World Screwworm as the state veterinarian during that time. So yes, I think it's a very good point. A lot of thank yous. Great information. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Yes, I think we got through the questions, at least in the chat. We still got a couple of minutes. One thing, I would say that maybe instead of trying to get more questions, because we'll be available to answer questions, and definitely people can go to our website and get information, and people can always reach out to us later on to get more information. I would just sit there and say thank you so much for your participation on this call, as everybody who's called in and asked such excellent questions. It was really great to have the opportunity to talk to you guys. I think that us being able to work with you in the field and work with our federal partners is going to be key moving forward. And so we want to be able to kind of keep these communications, and we want you guys to know that we want and respect your appreciate your time and your feedback to us and thoughts on things, because it's going to be this kind of level of communication collaboration that we're going to need to be in the best place possible with North Carolina. I would really thank Dr. Ward, as always, for helping setting us up, and all as well as other people who have contributed to disseminating information to everybody here so we can get so many people on the line. And not the least, though, I would really like to thank Dr. Thompson for her time and knowledge and digging into this. And she has just been wonderful to work with, and I really appreciate her knowledge and experience in this. And so thank you so much, Dr. Thompson, for your time and presenting everything today.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank y'all.